Our final chapter deals with diversion, alternative dispute resolution, and specialty courts. So, over the last couple of decades, different jurisdictions have really experimented with different ways to handle case processing through the criminal justice system. So more and more authorities are using alternative sanctions. These include things like alternative dispute resolution, diversion, community-based corrections, and then what we call specialty courts, or more commonly problem-solving courts. So it's important to understand that once a criminal case is placed into the criminal justice system, that doesn't mean it's going to proceed throughout the entire system and be fully processed. You guys might recall from Intro to CJ that these cases tend to get funneled out, and some of this has to do with how they're sentenced, and some of it has to do with cases being dropped due to other reasons. So one trend lately has been what's called decriminalization, and sometimes this gets confused with legalization. So decriminalization means we remove something from being considered a crime. So for instance, some states have decriminalized marijuana. So Massachusetts several years ago decriminalized possession of less than an ounce of marijuana for adults. So it meant that it was still illegal, and it will remain illegal through December 15th, 2016, but you don't get processed through the criminal court system. Instead, what happens is if you have less than an ounce, you're given a ticket, right? So it's treated like a parking offense or a traffic offense. Other states have decriminalized marijuana use for medical purposes. Another trend has been towards what we call alternative dispute resolution. This is community-based informal dispute settlement between offenders and their victims. It's pretty similar to mediation, and generally the people that are targeted for this are misdemeanants. These are people who've committed misdemeanors. We tend not to use this for more serious cases, more serious offenses. We've also talked briefly in the chapter on sentencing philosophies about restorative justice. And so ADR, alternative dispute resolution, is a form of restorative justice. We're trying to find a civil remedy between a victim and the people that were victimized. The victimizers, the offenders. And this can be traced back to Aboriginal courts in other countries. This is used extensively with the juvenile justice system in New Zealand and Australia. So basically, this is a process that emphasizes repairing the harm that has been done to the victim and reintegrating the offender. We also want to try to actually hold the offender accountable by requiring them to enter into this agreement with the victim. Now, we don't force victims to engage in restorative justice. That's kind of up to them, but this can be a helpful method. And this is a newer approach. So some advantages here, if you go through alternative dispute resolution as an offender, you won't have a criminal record. That's obviously beneficial to you in a variety of ways, most importantly in terms of obtaining a job. Victims, I think, are a little bit more involved and they tend to feel more satisfied. They're given a say in the punishment and what's going to happen. It also removes cases, obviously, from the court docket. If the person has been sentenced to community service, the community may benefit from that. And it always requires victim compensation and restitution. And so the offender is often held accountable in a way that they might not be held through the actual criminal court system. Some disadvantages, well, we have an offender who's committed a crime and they're not going to get convicted of it. Some people might feel like it's not enough punishment. There's an argument that perhaps this approach is too lenient and may lead to reoffending. And punishments may not be proportional to the offense committed. So some things that are really helpful here is that the victim has more involvement. So in the criminal justice system, the victim is a witness like anyone else. The crime has actually been committed against the state, and the victim doesn't really have very much say. Here, the victim has more say, and their say has been increasing over time anyway, especially when we think about things like victim impact statements. This can add a lot of emotional appeal, though. So another thing that can happen is diversion. And diversion basically means, true diversion means that someone's been diverted from the court system, but diversion can happen at any place throughout the criminal justice process as well. So Massachusetts has 2 diversion programs, one for boys and one for girls. And that diversion is actually a court sentence, which actually makes it not really diversion at all. But this is basically the way that criminal defendants are diverted to community-based agency for treatment or they might be assigned to some type of counselor or social worker for the appropriate assistance. This usually involves some type of education or training, counseling, some type of therapy. Diversion serves several functions. One thing it does is it allows the offender to remain in their community. While they're remaining in their community, they could continue to work. That means they can make restitution to their victims. They could continue to support their families, and they avoid the stigma of being incarcerated. They also get to avoid the stigma of a criminal conviction because a lot of diversion programs, if the person completes it successfully, then the offense is no longer on their record. It also obviously would reduce jail and prison overcrowding. It would slow down the court dockets. Not slow them down, alleviate the court dockets. And it also allows the offender to remain in their community, make connections, and get the necessary help. So diversion originates in the U.S. through the early juvenile courts in Chicago and New York in the late 1800s. Recall that the first juvenile court is opened in Chicago in Cook County in 1899. These are efforts that are made early on by religious groups and reformers, and they basically want to keep children from being imprisoned. At that time, children over the age of 8, so 8 and older, were considered eligible to be processed through the adult court. They could receive the same punishments, and they could be housed in the same types of facilities. So the goal here really was to remove them from the criminogenic influence of adult offenders. People that are excluded from diversion are usually anyone that's got a violent offense on their record. I worked in a juvenile diversion program. Anybody with a weapons charge was not allowed into the program. If someone has drug or alcohol dependencies, they might also not be eligible because they may need a different type of treatment. So generally what happens is diversion is often granted for low-risk first-time property offenders. Although again with juveniles, it is granted for some kids that do have some violent offenses on their record. Some criticisms here. Well, if we're diverting juveniles or diverting offenders to community programs, this could be adults as well, are we basically skirting the system, and should they actually be convicted of a crime? Just like plea bargaining, this also sidesteps all of our due process protections, right? So it's sort of assuming someone is guilty without a trial. And the other thing that happens is it leads to this process that's called net widening. So while what this is supposed to do is take people who normally would have been sentenced to incarceration that are at lower risk and sentence them to this, sometimes what happens is it also takes people who normally would have gotten probation but are on the higher end of that, the more concerning end, and it includes them in punishments they normally wouldn't have been exposed to. These often, due to lack of programs, also often exclude female offenders. So some other non-criminal sanctions, or criminal sanctions for that matter, community service is one way that we hold people accountable. It's different from restitution because you're performing some service for the state or the community. One problem with this is sometimes people are just assigned community service to do that isn't really necessary. So maybe someone's been assigned to paint a room that otherwise just wouldn't have been painted or doesn't even need to be painted. In that case, the community service isn't very meaningful. So is community service a punishment, though? It's considered a punishment. It's imposed by the courts, and many different types of projects are undertaken. When I worked with boys that were in the diversion program, one of the things they did in the winter for community service was they would be taken around to the different courthouses and they would shovel snow and break up the ice. These are projects usually supervised by probation office staff. In Massachusetts, however, this is supervised by the Community Corrections Program. So, is this actually effective? Well, many offenders are released into communities to serve community service, and that raises a concern for some people. Mostly because people don't realize most of these offenders are low risk anyway and nonviolent. Some research regards community service and restitution as just and fitting punishments. And these can also, community service can also accompany some other type of sentence. Restitution is also a victim-initiated action. This is a practice of requiring someone to compensate their victim for any damages that may have occurred. And there's several different models of restitution. Normally, restitution is paid to the court, and then the court pays it to the victim. So one is the financial/community service model. This stresses the offender's financial accountability to pay for damages. This could involve cleanup activities in municipal parks, painting projects, etc. Cutting courthouse lawns, pretty similar to shoveling courthouse snow. There's a victim offender mediation model. So basically, this focuses upon the victim and offender reconciling. Alternative dispute resolution is used as a mediating ground here. Victim reparations model stresses that offenders should compensate victims directly for their offenses. And most states have provisions for this. A lot of times you're going to pay court fines, and one of those fines for most people that are involved in court is money that goes into the Victims Compensation Act. That's money used by the state to reimburse victims for costs associated with their victimization. So all states and the federal government do have victim compensation programs, and as I mentioned, this has resulted in fines and restitution and community service really becoming common features of federal sentencing and state sentencing as well. So we also have seen the development of what's called specialty or problem-solving courts. These are basically courts that are set up to deal with one particular type of problem. So drug courts are an example of a specialty court. There's also veterans courts, teen courts. And they're basically everybody that's involved in the system in that particular courthouse or that particular courtroom is an expert in whatever particular matter they're dealing with. So there's usually 5 elements underlying here. The justice is usually tailored to the needs of each case. So again, if we think of something like drug courts, the courts have established partnerships with other agencies, which can make it easier to get people access to the services they need. The people involved in that courtroom work group are making informed decisions. They also often hold people more accountable. So the drug court system does hold offenders much more accountable. And the focus here is on solving the underlying problem and focusing on actual results. So the first drug court begins in 1989, and now there's drug courts in every single state, and the first one was in Miami. They're basically looking at the problem here that addiction is really at the heart of the offender's criminal behavior. And if you can address the underlying addiction, you can in turn address the criminal behavior. Drug court participants receive counseling. They're also more required to come into the court and be held accountable more often as well. And these seem to be pretty successful. It's also domestic violence courts, and this obviously revolves around providing consistent responses and best practices to domestic violence cases. It also allows the court to really coordinate and advocate for victims. It also holds the offender more accountable. Critics of this say, well, the criminal justice system doesn't really do a good job at protecting victims from further abuse. And so one of the reasons these courts have developed is because traditional approaches don't seem to make a difference for domestic violence offenders. We talked about youth courts in the juvenile justice chapters. These are often referred to as teen courts or peer courts, and this is also just another alternative to traditional methods of processing juveniles. These are pretty informal, and they can be, pretty therapeutic, also for the teens that are serving as jurors or judges as well. We have mental health courts. Again, these are people that are going to be experts in dealing with how mental health is playing a role in someone's criminal offending. These are specialized courts designed to deal with defendants. Basically, what we want to do is stop their contact with the criminal justice system, give them access to the support services they need in the community, and help them to be functional, participating members of the community. So I mentioned we have veterans courts. We've seen, since we've been at war for an extended period of time now, we've seen increases in post-traumatic stress disorder. This often can find veterans engaging in criminal behavior. The first one crops up in 2008 in Buffalo, New York, and they're run from a therapeutic justice approach. So basically they want to provide an approach to dealing with substance abuse, domestic violence, and to give those who have served their country a chance to really reintegrate back into society. And that wraps up our last chapter.